I'd like to welcome you here today for Scott Atran's lecture, Looking for Al-Qaeda. Does it say it up there? Oh, it doesn't have the subtitle here. The Evolution of Terror Networks. Scott's current academic home is in Paris, where he's the Director of Anthropological Research at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. But he's also a very well-known figure around the campus here at the University of Michigan. Over the years, he's had appointments at ISR, at the Anthropology Department, the Psychology Department, as well as here at the Ford School. He's written many, many papers and 5 books covering topics in anthropology, psychology, sociology, and his work has been widely cited in major media outlets. His latest book will be published by MIT Press in March. It's titled The Native Mind and the Cultural Construction of Nature. In it, he and his co-author Douglas Medin draw on nearly 2 decades of cross-cultural and developmental research to examine the relationship between how people think about the natural world and how they act on it, and how these two phenomena are affected by cultural differences. He was here on campus this past academic year and taught a very well-received course here in the Ford School called Transnational Terrorism, Religion, and the Limits of Reason. We're really delighted to have him back here today to deliver this public lecture. We will try to leave some time at the end of the lecture for your questions, and we hope that you will then, after that, join us for a reception and more conversation after the lecture in the hall just outside there. Outside the auditorium. So with all of that, I now welcome Scott Atran to the podium. Scott?
Thanks. Glad to be back here. I'm going to walk a little, so I'm going to move this like this so I can see a little better. Some of these slides I'm going to go through fast because Bob wouldn't let me shorten my presentation because he said we had work to do. So it's a little bit long. And so don't read the slides unless I really stop on them. I'm going to use them sort of as props to keep me going. This is a scene from the Madrid trial, which I attended. Very interesting trial. This will give you a picture of sort of what a group of terrorists look like, right? And there's nothing terribly informative about them. And in fact, these guys are pretty much a bunch of losers. Is Qaeda or its viral movement an existential threat to the United States or anybody else? And my answer is not unless we make it so, and we're doing a very good job of making it so. On October 25th, 1962, there was a vote in a nuclear submarine about whether to launch nuclear weapons against the United States. The United States didn't know at the time that Soviet Premier had given operational control of nuclear weapons to the submarine commanders, but release of those weapons depended upon a unanimous vote by the 3 commanders of the sub. 2 voted to launch them. 1, named Vasily Arkhipov, probably saved the world. He deserves 5 Nobel Prizes. There was an existential threat at the time. There were tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, each one on the average about 10 times more powerful than the one that destroyed Hiroshima, and could have destroyed hundreds of millions of people within 90 minutes. Nothing remotely like that exists today. Nothing in the wildest dreams of these guys could compare to that. However, the reaction of the United States, I consider to be a fairly hysterical one, has led to the growth of this movement around the world to where it has become now on the verge of becoming truly dangerous in places like Pakistan, which does have nuclear weapons. What we're witness to do, what we're witness today is a sort of leaderless, decentralized jihad. There are no leaders. There's no command and control. It has the properties of networks, and of course networks are very different from hierarchies. Hierarchies have command and control. They have delegated responsibilities. Networks are flatter. They are looser. They are more flexible. They are also much more liable to be infiltrated and disrupted than our hierarchies. However, like criminal networks, terrorist networks overcome this problem by having very thick personal ties, especially ties based on kinship and friendship, which overcome that. In addition, terrorist networks differ from criminal networks, gangs, drug cartels, by the fact that the people who belong to them are revolutionaries, in the sense that they are committed to something that they're willing to sacrifice for that goes beyond their material interests. You have to ask yourself, why do revolutions win out against much more powerful, resource-rich adversaries? And the reason is basically because of the commitments they're willing to make, of the sacrifices they're willing to suffer in order to achieve their goals. And that's what makes revolutions very difficult to wipe out. And the jihad is a revolutionary movement. It is part of a massive, transnational, media-driven political awakening that has a fairly simple message. A message that Muslims everywhere are under attack and that justice in the world can only be brought about by the violent overthrow of the current world order. I'm not going to go into the formal properties of these networks. Let me just give you a little notion of what the jihad is all about. People often conflate Wahhabi, Salafi, jihadi, Arab, Muslims. The jihadis are not Wahhabis in general. The Wahhabi movement is a purist, Salafi-like movement, fundamentalist movement, restricted pretty much to Saudi Arabia, that is devoted to the Saudi regime and has been for quite some time, does not preach the violent overthrow of the government, and does not preach attacks against fellow Muslims, except for Shia. The Salafi movement is a much more general, purist movement, similar to fundamentalism in the United States, but it would be wrong to equate the jihadi movement with the Salafi movement in general, just like it would be wrong to equate the Christian identity movement with, say, Christian fundamentalism, or William Pierce and his brand of militant white supremacism with the Christian fundamentalist movement in general. This is a movement which can best be described as the Takfiri movement. The Takfiri movement grew up in Egypt in the 1970s, first in a fairly benign form under Sheikh Mustafa. And it preached Takfir wal-Hijra, which means excommunication and withdrawal. The idea was to emulate the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, where he withdrew with his friends. He regathered forces in order to go out again to spread the word of Islam and eventually conquer Mecca. The original Takfiri movement was a movement of withdrawal. It based much of its ideology on the writings of a marginal leader of the Muslim Brotherhood named Sayyid Qutb, who had spent time in the United States. He was hanged by Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1966. And his message of jahiliyyah, of impurity having swept into the Muslim world, was having an enormous echo among students in Egypt at the time, especially after the Six-Day War and the defeat of the Egyptian armies and the humiliation that caused. When Mustafa died in 1978, the Takfir wal-Hijra movement turned violent. The students who were not originally part of the movement but were in prison at the same time as Sheikh Mustafa and who were radicalizing then drew upon his teachings about withdrawal, but also argued that it was right and good to kill fellow Muslims who had become kafir, who had become infidel and could be excommunicated. In 1980, they formed their first movement. It was called the Tanzim al-Jihad. One of the 6 emirs of the Cairo section of that movement's name was Ayman Zawahiri, who has since become the sort of number 2 of Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda itself is a development of this branch of the Takfiri movement. Almost all of the leaders, the senior leaders of the Al-Qaeda movement that began coalescing around bin Laden in the summer of 1988 were Egyptian. And the Egyptian core of Al-Qaeda is this Takfiri core is what made al-Qaeda what it is. The only difference is that under bin Laden's tutelage in the mid-1990s, the focus of the jihad went from attacking apostate governments within the Muslim world to attacking what they thought was the root cause of the continued existence of those governments, which was the far enemy, meaning the United States and its allies. Now, I'm going to give you some stats of the first wave of this movement in al-Qaeda. Our sample is 439 from al-Qaeda, 164 from the Jama'a Islamiyya, which is an affiliated organization from Southeast Asia, and from a recent sample of Saudi jihadis who were not explicitly parts of al-Qaeda, given to me by the Minister of the Interior of Saudi Arabia. And what we find is